So in today's tutorial, I kind of wanted to look at like chords in more depth. So like the minimal genre, or like minimal house, minimal deep tech, however you classify it, deep house kind of tends to use a lot of chords, which can range from as little as 1 to 2 chords to as many layers as you maybe see here. So there's like certain genres where the chords essentially make the genre, in my opinion. And like artists that do it quite well, like Djoko, Robbie Doherty, Chris Dussy, and so many more. And it's kind of what I associate with the genre is like these kind of like dubby chords. So I kind of just wanted to do like a tutorial, or maybe it might even be more than one, depending on how long it is, which like really goes into how to make these chords. So it's kind of like split into 3 things. It's kind of split into sound choice, the note itself, like the chords itself and the placement of that, and the effects. So it's kind of like 3 parts, which I'll see how much I can cover in this one and maybe do a part 2 or 3 depending. But I kind of wanted to like go in depth on like how they kind of like might get these sound, because I know a lot of people tend to ask me, and it's a sound that's just so prominent in the genre, and it can often sound really impressive. So I thought I'd do a full deconstruction of the sound. So just for reference, I've got 3 examples which I looked at. There's probably better ones, but 3 examples which kind of show what I'm talking about when it comes to the chords. So just listen to the chords. So there's like a chord here, and then there's one here. So he's got 2 chords in his pattern, which are kind of the same. This one. The chords are more heavy in that one, but the example I wanted to look at more depth, because it's kind of similar to the amount of chord patterns I have here. I think that's where people struggle, is this one. So just in that first bit, I count at least 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Roughly 5. It's going too fast, but it's kind of like a good example of like sounds that work together and kind of bounce off one another. So I think where it's probably best to begin is with the kind of like chords themselves. So you'll see here, I'll move these ones up because they're kind of like extra, so ignore these. You'll see here, you essentially have like chords that are in different places. So I'm gonna loop. This is already looped. You have 5 different chords, which I've put into a group, and you've essentially just got them in different places. So what I'd normally start with is the chord itself. So I'll start with this number 1. I'll put the volume up just for... So I am going for... This is A minor, so the whole track's in A minor. So what I'd call this chord the call track. Like, basically thinking like call and response. So I'd have the first chord, which I'd try and nail down, and then I'd basically like following on, I'd have the other chords bouncing off that first one, or the one before it essentially. So like, so I've drawn this A minor and I've put it on the half beat here. And I'll take all the effects off just so you can kind of see what I mean. Like, so it's kind of like it's on the half beat, and it's like a very basic sound. But I'd normally start with a very basic sound, like this is just analog. And I basically look to just place them here. And then you can basically, you hold shift on another pattern, you can see the previous pattern, so this one, grayed out, and then you can start drawing notes that bounce off that pattern. So I'll do this one. And that's also an A minor, but with like a different sound. It's the exact same chord, no note variation whatsoever. And then moving down, you hear like how they bounce off one another quite easily. And pretty much every single one of these I've put on the offbeat, which is because it tends to work quite well for like groove and stuff. And the chord C, E, A is basically just like an inversion of the other one. So what you can basically do is you can play around with that original chord, but you can like change any note up or down an octave. Move that up. Which makes it more interesting, because if you keep these A minor chords all the same, it's not gonna really like bounce off one another and appeal to you. Even though the sound's different, it will probably sound better, but you kind of want to vary up the chords. So here I've simply just used the same E minor, but you can even go further and like go for like E minor, or basically to do like keys that are similar. As long as it's like in the scale, it doesn't have to be that A minor chord. It can be any chord in that scale. That's a G. So you can hear how it works well going up to the A. There. And then moving down, I've not actually done much more when it comes to like the placement, but I think the notes are different. I've added like a 7th chord. And there's a characteristic about this sound which is quite nice, which I'll go into in a bit more depth in the sound design part. But it's basically like a sweep. So you've not only got, I have no idea why that's, you basically it's like a sweep, which is a really nice like transition chord. So you've not only got the notes that are different, but you've got a sound which, like, these are all kind of short notes, like stabby chords, which is nice, but you can like mix it up with like pad type sounds, which basically like offers like a transition effect like this. And I think this next one's the same, but it's got like and they're like big chords as well, so like it's really obvious, so it works really nicely, to be fair. I just like undo everything with the volume and stuff. Ignore like the inconsistent volume, I'm just turning it up so you can hear it. But yeah, you can essentially hear like do placement, notes, and note length. You can just hear like how important it is. And what I'll show just now actually is just like a smaller version of what I could do. I could essentially like, just to show the effect of placement, you've basically got like grids and stuff, and I like to keep it on narrow, but if you just work off like 16ths, I'll just show a much shorter version so it's not looping all the time. Like if you just experiment, if you draw a chord about this long and you experiment with, you can experiment with how long it is, but you can also experiment just like move it on the grid along the 16ths. And you'll hear what works and what doesn't. There's offbeat ones that work quite well, and there's ones like on the grid that work quite well. And like how you'd place like a snare and you'd expect it to work there. You can hear like a lot of them work, and you can get really creative with like where you place them. Like you can essentially have that kind of like first note chord to guide you, but then you can just start placing stuff on the grid which works with those chords. And you should probably addition them with other elements as well, just in case. So you hear just there, like there's a lot that work, and ultimately it depends on the other chords you've sequenced, but you can quite easily play chords off one another, and like I said, you can hold shift. If you don't visualize it like this and you have it like minimized, you could like hold shift to basically see where previous notes have taken up the space, because a lot of minimal house is that minimal aesthetic where you don't want it to be like overcomplicated. So you can place notes that kind of work off one another quite well, and you don't really want to be placing chords on top of each other, maybe with like the exception of like what I've done here, where it's like 2 layers of chords and sounds that just work quite well together. That's kind of like how I think of it, like as in like a chord group. So like that's where I would start, like essentially with the chords, and I'd pick any old patch like analog, or like the Simpson Ableton. Like I wouldn't even open up a decent synth at that point, until I've kind of got that placement, and then just as like an extra, like this kind of type of chord. So you've got this chord group here. And it depends how chord heavy you want your song. I did notice in a few of like the references I was listening to for examples, there was some songs that were more stripped, like that Robbie Doherty track, which had like 2 chords, which would have been just like these two. Probably these two actually. These 2 examples here would have been kind of like what Robbie Doherty did in that track, but with maybe like these 2 chords here instead. But something I like built on, because I tend to get carried away when doing these project files, but I also noticed like when Djoko kind of switches between a lot of chords and not so many, and then some of his tracks are like primarily chords. So you could then experiment with like still in key. If I look at this, A minor, it's an A minor with the A above as well. And then I was speaking of like not always using the A chord. So within these, you could have like what I did here, where I moved it to a G. You could start having like chord-based patterns. So you could have these chord like one shots, which is like kind of what I associate with genre. But then you could also like, I'll take this filter off. So essentially, ignoring that, well actually even if I was to pretend that chord wasn't there, you've got all this space here, and that could be taken up by other elements. But if you imagine this is the drop, you've not got anything melodic until the second part. This whole drop gap is like empty, so you could start filling with like kind of like chord jams, I think of it. So like, and I'll put the like effects back on. It basically keeps the track kind of more interesting with busier patterns, and you've essentially just got like A, E, G, E, and A, and then this rhythm here. Like, there's not really like a go-to rule when it comes to these kind of things, but you can get pretty creative. You don't just have to stop after what I associate as like the chord group with single chords. You can start jamming with whatever you want, and then I'll play these 2 separately. That's just an A, E, that's just an A down to an E, just like 2 chords. And like a nice fill there. So these kind of play, they don't bounce off one another like the other ones do, but they kind of counter one another quite nicely. Like they play together and it fits, and then they add separate chords. And you can hear how it's like more driving, depending on like what kind of track you want to go for. You could have like a breakdown, which essentially so yeah, that's kind of like how I'd think of it. Like obviously you could go on with chords for ages, and I feel like it's one of the things that like really kind of defines the genre. So although it's probably the most boring part, the like MIDI information, so like your chord, your placement, your note length, and like getting chords to bounce off one another, experimenting with chords within the scale, like all that kind of thing. If I was to summarize, those are like the things you should be looking for. And if you like I said with sound design, which we'll move on to shortly, like you don't have to use the stock stuff. Like I said, like you don't need to get. You can kind of do it in either order. You can like choose sounds you think will work and then do the chords, or you can do chords and then choose the sounds. So if you want, you can open up your kind of favorite VST, but I find like for context, if I just I'll show this one. This is just analog. So I find, for example, like I can literally just drop analog in, and you'll see like I've barely altered anything. Like frequency and resonance, maybe a bit of detune and stuff, but without effects, like it's still you can still kind of contextualize like what might work essentially. And then the EQ is basic. The effect rack I add that from Sound Toys, but you can add like any multi effect rack, and that's what I use for like reverb and delay to put these in space. Chorus, I find works really well on these sounds, and then a filter which I'll talk about like this. Like I feel like that's one of like the go-to effects in this genre. So basically what I was trying to get to is the sound doesn't really matter to begin with. I'd say this matters more, and then you can essentially pick any patch, stock or third party, whatever plugin you fancy, but don't like stress about the sound as much until you've kind of like nailed this kind of part, because you can always tweak the sound. But while you're listening to those sounds, if there's like say like a clash here, if there's two sounds that don't work, you'll think, oh, that's like if you've picked like a pad and some nasty synth up there, like those notes can work well together, but you've just happened to have picked a patch that doesn't work, and you can essentially change that sound whenever you want. And you can also change the notes, yes, but if you're going from like the most basic synth patches, like the most raw sounds, like literally all of these are analog with like minor tweaks. Also like a square wave and stuff. So yeah, that's kind of it on the chord front. Let me know if you have any questions about that. But for now, let's move on to the patches themselves. So as I kind of talked about a bit in the last section, the kind of next important part, which you can do one basically either before you start doing the chords or after. Probably a bit of both, where you choose like a rough patch and then you kind of tweak it based on how you've set the MIDI up. And it's kind of the same when you move on to like the third part, which is the effects. You kind of do them all together and you keep making tweaks to all of them, but it makes sense just to separate them into like different parts in terms of like thinking. So to do with patches and like what synth do I use for minimal house chords and stuff, which is like a common question I often get asked. The answer, which you won't be wanting to hear, is it doesn't really matter what synth you use. I'd say what's more important is actually the chords, the octave it's playing at, and yeah, the chords the octave it's playing at, and the length of the notes. Like these kind of short notes often result in very stabby sounds. So like for example, if I just flip between the different patches I've used, you'll see analog here, another analog with different waves, and some ADSR alterations, wavetable, the first introduction to third party but layered with analog, which that might actually be the same patch as before, with some tweaks, which is always a good thing to do. Like if you want your sounds to sound like they belong to one another, use similar patches and change them up slightly. And a third party plugin, just a random one. I can't even remember who that's by. I think it might even be I think it's like a cheap sampler, which just goes to show you like you can literally use anything. Like this plugin's literally never recommended for this kind of sound ever, but I've used it as a sampler. OBXA, which I think is like Arturia, which I like quite a lot, for its like default preset. I think I've literally just used its default preset. Like obviously there's different loads of different effects on these things, so ignore that, but it is quite a basic patch which I always use because I like how it sounds. I've used that, and I've used I think like Arturia's Rhodes type plugins, because Rhodes sounds and keyboard sounds tend to work quite well as chords, and in this kind of like genre we're trying to recreate. I can just literally show on like the most basic. And then so yeah, you'll see like I've used a lot of like third party stuff, mainly to just kind of demonstrate how you can get decent sounds with that stuff. And yeah, so like if I was to suggest some plugins just to kind of like answer people's questions, like ultimately you can use a lot of different plugins. Like they all do pretty much the same thing, and have different like sounds and libraries and that kind of thing. So that tends to be the main overall like difference between these things. But what you're kind of wanting to think about, if you're looking at these third-party plugins, what you kind of want to look at is, I'll see if this plugin offers it, like if it has like types and stuff, because you can get lost in like flicking through plugins. So essentially, like this one doesn't have many categories, but you're essentially wanting to look at like things that you'd associate with having chords. So like I said, like keyboards, like Rhodes, organs, that kind of thing. Like those kind of types of instrument work really well because you can literally just imagine like a piano player playing a chord. Like chords are meant to be played on these instruments, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. So like here we've got keys. Brass could work. Might be interesting, but probably not. Lead, maybe, but these tend to be like best for like single voice. Obviously there's going to be like differences within these, but if I was just to like suggest where I'd look, organ, yes. Pad is the one like this. I actually skipped this. I used Diva. So if I was to suggest a good plugin for these types of effects, I'd consider like Arturia, like their kind of effects bundles. They tend to work quite well. Like Analog Lab has like all those sounds, and I'd probably, if I just look in instruments, any of this list essentially, like Omnisphere, Analog Lab, Diva, maybe not massive for like chord sounds, Monopoly. There's so many options, like I'm saying, like I'm not gonna like go into like what's the best, because there isn't a best. It's what's best for you, really. So like I was saying with this, I'd use like Diva, but then if I just try and find it, you've got like Polysynth, Dream Synth, these kind of things. And what you kind of want to look out for here is to pick a patch which works when you play multiple notes. Because like there's some sounds, because we're playing a chord here, there's some sounds which won't work when you play a chord, especially in Diva anyway. But then if you play like a single note as opposed to a pad sound, some of the patches, I think most of them will work here because I've selected poly, but like just when experimenting with your patches, be wary that some patches don't suit chords. Some do, so you might have to tweak it down to like a single note as opposed to like drawing in the whole chord. Both can deliver equally good results, but you've essentially got these as your like kind of like plugins. If I had to suggest two personal favorites, it'd be Analog Lab and Diva, but like I said, it all kind of depends on all this information here and the effects. You can take the worst sound with a decent chord, and you can literally just, if I show this analog here, so I filtered it down because I don't want all its brightness. Perhaps too nasty. And then you can like tweak its attack. I think that's the attack on the filter. You can detune them. You can change the wave. There's so much possibility. But you can essentially take a patch which sounds semi-usable in its rawest form and make it into something which actually sounds quite good. Obviously the effects play a large part in that, like the difference between the effects and none of them, versus is quite quite stark. But just like the filters and the like ADSR envelopes are a good starting place, and then when you start detuning, you're kind of starting to head into the effects territory. So these are kind of like tweaks I'd make, and if you wanted to kind of hear your sound in more context before you started getting crazy with the effects, you could set up like returns, sends and returns. So I've got like my standard, like all of these are reverbs, all of these are different delays, and then compression. So it's easy to kind of hear it on the fly, instead of like altering your workflow to then go into the effects, to then go into sounds and like switching between them. Like it's good to like go between these stages, and it's something I said you should and you will find yourself doing. But you can basically set up these returns, which kind of gives you a better idea of how the sounds will work. Like that isn't going to give me much to go off, as opposed to having a bit of reverb and delay on it. I can see where it might work, and then start tweaking. So if I just kind of I'll go over this patch first, because this is like the very first chord I put in, the kind of cold chord. So I'd basically have this patch, and these are kind of like the parameters I'd look to map. I'd maybe change the shape of the wave. The noise one, not in this case, but I could go for anything, and that's going to be the start of like where you're talking, like what might sound good. You're picking the sounds, the waves. So like my first thought is normally the sound itself. Then my next thought is the ADSR. This is for the filter. So it's this. So the decay and sustain are normally the ones I'll look at. Do I want it really stabby, or do I want it quite long? In this case, I want kind of in between. I want it to end quite soon as well. I don't want to like drag it on, because especially with effects and loads of chords, it can get quite messy. That's kind of like a decent kind of length, really. And you'll see in some of these other patches, I've got the attack here, so I'll probably just show it on this one, just like so you can see like the attack's basically how long it takes for the sound to reach its like max level. So something that can be quite good is, although you've drawn the notes here, with the attack you can essentially delay it slightly. So yes, it's on the grid technically, but the sound itself, like the ADSR envelope, determines when they actually play, essentially. So you can have this like so you'll see there that chord comes in straight away, as opposed to it kind of like fades in, which is a nicer effect. And like when you balance like different envelopes of chords, you get quite a nice cohesive rip. And like for these pad ones especially, I call it the sweep, this one here. If I go to it, it doesn't really like, the attack's quite crucial because it doesn't really, the chord doesn't really work if it doesn't have that attack. Like it does, but like the attack kind of makes it a lot smoother and it kind of seems less random. And so if you have like these kind of like chords, like pad sweep type sounds, the attack can be quite nice to like basically make it longer and make the fade more gradual essentially, as opposed to coming in straight away like da 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 da, like do, like a bit longer, you know what I mean? Like so yeah, going back to this one, so ADSR, which I haven't mapped, which is these ones for the sound itself, and then you could also alter, let me find it. This, well then I'd go to the filter, which is this, if you think of minimal house, if you're ever like stuck on trying to create any of the elements, the filter is literally the best effect for that like type of sound. Like minimal is basically filtered down music, and the filter is obviously what helps create that, strip away frequencies from sounds. Like it's all good and well having like a full sound like this, but like it sounds so much better when it's like filtered. So strip away all those like nasty frequencies, and it's already sounding very dubby. This doesn't have to be set because you can do more filtering, which I would recommend here. And then if you wanted to go one extra, you could even, you've got the filter, you could like alter the envelope of the filter. So it's like basically how long it takes for the filter to kick in. So yeah, that's just kind of like basic stuff you can be doing on these sounds. And then, like I said, alter the wave. And I've not really done much differently here. Like obviously there's different effects, but nothing like too different from the first one. Like it's all just about finding that first kind of chord element, like I said, and building on it really. Like so you kind of see like I've got two rather basic patches, but the chords have helped me to kind of shape those patches, especially the envelope where the envelope's concerned. The sound themselves can be like basic waves, and then you can essentially just alter the filter and the ADSR to kind of shape it more to your liking, and that's before you even introduce effects. I'll just go down further and see if there's anything new on these. That's another basic synth, where only the filter and the amp's been altered. So yeah, here's a good example of the ADSR. You'll see like the attack being loads, the sound doesn't come in much, so it's kind of like weaker. So there's a lot of like tweaking you can be making, which make massive differences. Not so much. So the attack makes a huge difference, especially like here maybe, like you could have the attack longer on this sound so it doesn't clash. And that blends well. There's so much possibility here, like I can only offer like speculation and general ideas of what you might want to do and how you can do it. But like hopefully this is like a more comprehensive way of like basically teaching you how to kind of do this type of sound. Most of it is experimentation, but there is like kind of set ways to do it, and a lot of the sound crafting comes through that experimentation. Like I can't really teach you that stuff. So next I have a sweep for the sound. I'll just this one here, which works really well, which is down to this effect here. I basically open the filter. That's kind of like the effect you hear. I'll go into that more. But you hear the patch is like basically the same. Sorry. I'll turn that up. And like it is kind of like a pad sound, but because it's been done in analog, it could be a synth, like a lead sound. But it works as a pad is essentially what I'm getting at. Like I was saying about the best kind of sound types to choose rather than plugin is like your keyboards and your pads, because the keyboards are meant to be playing chords, so most of the time it'll work, and then the pads are also meant to be playing chords, but like more like longer ones, and you can essentially take these long chords and strip them back. I'll just show. Like literally, you've got this full sound. It's like I was saying about the filters. You've got this full sound and you've basically made it minimal by altering the frequency. And a lot of like the effects used in this genre are to do with like the filter, like I said, and like modulating it. So if I just show here, you can hear like the kind of like dubby texture you sometimes hear, like. And it works better with like bandpass. Or not. But if basically like we'll get onto the effects. but modulating the frequency here, you'll hear just how like crazy you can get, and you can get really close to achieving that texture. So the reason I recommend like pad sounds is you've got that full sound which you can strip back using the filter, so you don't have to have all the harsh top end or the low end of the pad. You can strip it back or strip it down to like hardly any frequencies if you want, and then you can start moving them, like automating, and you can also alter the envelope. So a pad is a typically long sound. Like there's certain pads that you could, if you put a pad into a simpler, you could play and it would never like just now actually the ADSR basically would determine how long it would play, but pads can drag on in terms of their sound. It's not like a pluck or a stab like I was saying here. Like this sound will end quite quickly. Whereas a pad, for any editing, it'll play on. It's a full, basically it's a full sound, and pads are very good to use for these types of chords groups type things, essentially. Not, I mean, so you've got this pad here, which I'll just loop somewhat. I've detuned it. I've had some unison. And some vibrato. So like, without the effect, it kind of works. So pads, essentially pads are like really good to use. And then I've layered it with this. It's like a choir. And you can get quite creative with this, like, yeah, again, this plugin's essentially a sampler with like loads of different old school samples and stuff. So I've gone for a choir because a choir is one of those ones that also tends to work for chords, and I've basically layered it with the same, like you can have all these separate sounds, but something you might want to do, especially here, like I said, I've got basically the same chords playing with slightly different envelopes, is you could layer these into one instrument rack, like what I've done here, and just layer the sounds, basically because you've got the same note playing, and when you've got so many chords like this, it can get quite confusing knowing what you're listening to when you're looking at it. So that's just an idea. Like samplers can work quite well for these sounds. And then, like I said, I've got these patches here which probably won't make a difference. That's just the default one, which is actually in brass. So like, you can definitely find sounds within these categories, but I'd always suggest like the padding keys as like a starting point. I've got that, and then I've got the Rhodes plugin, which is just full of nice sounds. So that is kind of like an overview of the kind of sounds I'd be looking for. I tend to think of it more as like what sounds do I need more than what plugins do I need, because the majority of plugins, like synth-based plugins, can create most sounds. So if you're looking for like the minimal health chords, stabs, that kind of thing, my first train of thought would always be like look for like presets like keys and pads. But I wouldn't even say you have to use like these synths. Like you can literally, like I showed, use analog and create something which works. It might require a bit more work to take these like raw sounds and make them into something better. So one advantage that like a plugin might have, if you can find a preset that works, that is to kind of give you context for these chords. But you can essentially just start with like an analog patch and maybe like tweak them slightly so you can hear contrast when you're playing these chords. And that is essentially how I would do it, like in terms of like looking for plugins. And then I've obviously also talked a bit about like how I'd be tweaking these plugins before we even get to effects. So like the frequency and the envelope of both the filter and the sound, and then maybe some detuning and whatever else is available within the synth, like the shapes and stuff. You can basically experiment with these sounds and get something which works, and then you can start thinking about like effects and stuff, which is what I will talk about next. The final thing I would think about is effects. Essentially, these kind of effects I'd say are key to achieving that kind of sound. So if I was to like generalize the types of effects I'd be looking at, filters. Filters, kind of like modulation, so like your chorus, your phaser, your flanger, that kind of thing. Your space-based effects, so your like delays, echoes, reverbs, which I've basically used in all the chords in some capacity. And I'd like I group them, but I find that placing different reverbs and different amounts on each can be a nice way to get like contrasting parts. Essentially, like you could put them into a space within a group and like send it to an effect, but I find that basically going through each and using different effects can work quite well. So like I said, like those kind of effects tend to be quite good, and obviously there's no like limit when it comes to effects. Like you can put whatever you want on really, but those are kind of like the ones I'd be looking at as a starting point anyway. And you can use a lot of like Ableton stock as well to achieve these sounds. So I'll do another run through it. I'll do a quick run through of like the sounds I've got here. So I've used an EQ, external Soundtoys effect rack, a chorus, and a filter. You'll see a common theme with these. EQ, Microshift, which is like a modulation based plugin. Filter Freak, like rhythmic filter modulation. Reverb delay and a filter. Then another filter freak, another delay. Phaser, reverb, filter, and then a delay on this multi-effects plugin. More of the same. Flanger, reverb, filter, phasers, that kind of thing, and nothing too dissimilar. Like all of them are using pretty basic effects which fall into one of those categories of modulation, filtering, or like based effects, and that's kind of all you really need. So I'll kind of like talk about what I think of as the most important effect first, which I touched on briefly, which is the filter. So here, I was mentioning how like you don't really want to use all of the sound, like with the pads. I was saying you want to kind of strip it down. So with the filter, I'm always like looking to take something out. So it could be this is like you could take the lows out, but I would normally take the lows out at the start just to clean it. So you could have, I'd normally have it like here, and then I'd be like looking to try and like what can I get away with taking out essentially, and what still sounds good. So I'd be looking for the point of that, and like it was like I was saying here, you don't need to stress over the frequency here because I find altering it later actually can work just as well. So you've got this filter, and then you can change like the types. I like the band pass because it takes out the lows, which we don't want anyway, but it also takes out some of the highs. You can kind of like sweep. So basically I've got this frequency here, and it will take out the frequencies essentially around this point. But I think like a key part of minimal house, and like something I'd always try and do in like a lot of music, no matter what the style, is keep things interesting, and that's where modulation can come into play. So this filter here, you can essentially alter how much it's like sweeping up and down. So you might have heard of the Max for Live LFO effect. I can't find it. This one, when it appears, if my Ableton loads. Basically, the LFO effect is basically a standalone version of this, where you can there we go. It might look something different, but there's different LFO versions. And what you can do, if you don't turn this on, what some people would do is you can like map the LFO here to the frequency or any plugin, and you can get pretty creative with this. It's something I would recommend trying on loads of different effects, just to like change the state of them over time. But you can essentially map it. This is a bit too fast. If I turn on the rate and like where it's sweeping to, you'll hear it's like really dubby, and then combined with like a reverb or a delay, that can work really well. So I'll unmap this because I don't actually want to use it for this particular effect. And what I would do, which is basically the same sine wave, and then where you can blend the amount. I think that's the only difference. You can change the rate. So the amount, it's how much it's moving. You'll hear that moves quite a lot. And then the rate is the thing I think it's literally like the game changer effect when it comes to these sounds. So as your reward for making it through these, if you've made it this far, it's literally this here. So you can set the rate, and I find between 0.5 and like 2 tend to work quite well. You can get really hectic if you go up like that. Like that's really hectic to me, but I like around 2, and then you can tailor how much you're altering it as well. So you'll hear just like with or without LFO, it works, and I don't use the LFO on everything, but I'd like to pick like a few sounds within. to basically have that movement, because I just think they sound more interesting. If I just play the grid patch. And that is essentially just doing this. So you can either alter the LFO, or you can like map it to an LFO, you can automate it for like more control. So I could quite literally go in here, and if I wanted it to sweep up and then end near the end of the sound, or like sweep down even. So the automation is that thing we all hate, but that's where you can get some really good results. But something I'll move on to with regards to the filter, because I personally don't like automating parameters that I know I might tweak, because like when you automate it, it's essentially locked to that value unless you tweak it, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. So what you can do is I'll turn this off and I'll go to the response layer here. I think it's the response layer. One of these layers, if I just find it, excuse me. Basically, while I find it, instead of doing the automation, you've got something called modulation. And you can essentially, I can't remember where I did it, but it doesn't really matter, to be honest. You can essentially do the exact same. I'll just demonstrate on this one. And I'll do this. So this sound is quite long, and it's obviously got like the delays and stuff. So you can shorten that delay to make it more solid. But what you can also do, if you find like a sound carries basically longer than you want, so like if it was to keep playing, it would maybe end there or something. So you could do that automation, but something I find works perhaps just as well, but I'd argue better in terms of like being able to customize stuff, is modulation, which is basically the same as automation. However, it's instead of being on the like arrangement, so you could automate some in here. You could like automate some in here, move it there, and then unless you duplicated that clip, it wouldn't appear again. Like unless you duplicated the automation. The automation's kind of like, the way I think of it is like more for arrangement. But if you have like a set MIDI clip here, I'll delete this automation, and then I could go to modulation instead, and I could automate it on the MIDI channel. So I've looped these MIDI channels, so basically every version of it will appear with modulation. But another good thing about it, I'll just make some tweaks. I'll change the filter as well so it's more obvious. So you see, like, I have changed it. But instead of automating and like being locked into that automation, now what I've drawn in basically just moves around the parameter I set. So the modulation is essentially like changing the parameter up or down beyond what I set it at, and I can easily tweak. But what I've basically drawn in is like a movement change is how I think of it like. So that's like kind of the benefit I like of using like modulation. It basically does the same thing, and then you'll see again with this clip, it's made the change, and then I could maybe do like something different. It doesn't work as well on that sound, I must admit, in comparison to maybe like this. As I could literally just, yeah. I'll do like extreme example. Or not even an extreme example, I'll do like a really subtle example. And if you change the grid, because I was locked into 16ths, to narrow or something, you can like really tweak it further. And then I can maybe like, if you hold Option, so this is kind of like what I was talking about to do with like the envelopes of the filter. But I find when I'm adjusting the ADSR of the filter, I can like find it hard to like hear the changes I'm making visually. But this is kind of the same when you do it with a filter. This is essentially your envelope. So that's the attack, and then it's going gradually down, so it's a mixture of its like other settings. And if I want it to fade into the filter, so like that's simply just how much it's moving. We could then, and then like I was saying, we could start a bit lower if we were going higher. And you'll just hear like that, to me sounds like exactly what I think of when I think of this genre. And then if we want to go even more mental, go for the amount. Or you could like start mapping and so you'll hear like basically filters are by far the most important effect you'll need. And modulating those filters. So like using filters to strip back the sound, but then modulating them to kind of like sweep either slowly or quickly. Like if you've got like a stabby sound, you might want it to be quite a quick modulation. Whereas here, for example, you might want like quite slow, similar to how I talked about the attack. You could have like a filter which slowly opens up. Because that other one's like a sweep across the spectrum, but this one kind of starts closed anyway, and you can maybe have it open up towards the end. So that's quite a nice like curve which you might draw. And it's another reason I like modulation, because you could do it to like reverb tails and stuff. You could have like your reverb quite low, and then you could towards the end of the bar bring it up. There's so much possibility. It's kind of ridiculous, to be honest. So you can basically sweep them up, and then I'd maybe advised against it with this, but if you had like a long section, you could like alter the dry wet of the delay, for example. Let me just find somewhere where it would be suitable to put this. I'll put this here. We could give this a try. It might sound awful, but you never know until you try. This one here, the response. Like, show... You need to basically click on the clip. That's something I need to do. And then you basically choose the effect, choose what you want to modulate, and we can have like a delay tail maybe, which goes from 0 to, we'll see what it goes to. Probably about 50. You don't see the value change, which is like, but it's moving anyway, regardless. Like, you could do it with automation. It ultimately depends what you prefer, like your workflow and stuff, what you prefer using. So that's kind of like probably the main effect, I'd say, that with the filters. And something you could also consider, basically Max for Live is wonderful when it comes to these things. Like, if you want something more interesting and you want to kind of add variation to your music or keep it interesting over time, you can add different Max for Live effects. So another one that comes to mind is the envelope follower. So like we were talking about when it comes to like modulation, you've essentially got, you can essentially alter how much it's moving within the modulation part here. But if you're a bit lazy, you can go to call. I'll just return to default. I won't return to default. Essentially what you can do here, envelope follower. So I was saying, like, you can go into the clip and basically draw curves depending on where the sound ends, which is probably going to give you the best results. But a useful device I find is the envelope follower, which, as you can see here, basically follows the sound that's coming in and like the envelope of it. And you can essentially map this. I will probably, what will I do? I'll duplicate this. And then if I do like an open close filter type thing here, you can map it not to the device on, but to the same kind of parameters as you would the LFO, with the difference being the LFO will move, the LFO will move the filter automatically regardless, even when, like literally, even when the sound isn't playing. So when you start a sound, like, you can alter the rate so it's on time. Maybe alter it to like 1. So it's more likely to be the same every time and more consistent. You can obviously choose like the rate and stuff. But the difference being here, you can see that moving automatically regardless of if the sound stopped or not. So if I was using LFOs, I'd either set the rate so it's the same every time, unless that's like the effect you want to go for, like complete randomization that not even you knows what's going to happen every time. Or if you don't want to do the modulation, something quite similar is essentially you can alter the envelope, map it to like whatever parameter you want to change, and then if I set like a range, I don't really want 100 because it's quite a high sound, and then I can, you'll see here, the filter's moved up and then moved down based on the envelope, and then I can obviously change I don't use the effect much, so I have to, oh yeah, here, okay, so this is how much it's moving up. So the gain is quite important. The rise, I think rise is like how fast it moves up. Yeah. So you can basically alter these settings to like do like an open close filter effect or whatever you want really based on the input signal. So that's quite a good thing to use. And then I'll kind of just touch on other effects because it's all like sound dependent. Like filters are the most important, but the other kind of effects I'm thinking of. So I'll start with like reverbs and delays. Like pretty self-explanatory, but like I showed this sound without any reverb and delay. Like it can be good to just throw reverb and delay in at the beginning. When you're kind of like trying to shape those sounds and design them at the very beginning, because it kind of helps put even the worst sounds into context. So I think we can like basically agree that like sounds like chords, especially when they're not so prominent, need something like reverb or delay to kind of fill the spectrum. And it's kind of like those sounds that are more prominent and play more, so maybe like a lead sound, where you'd maybe go a bit easier on the reverb. But you can essentially hear just, if I go for like the medium, that just sounds so much better, and then I can add delay, or I think that, and if I'm not using these parts, that actually would go quite well because it basically fills the listening space until these come in. So that's kind of like reverb and delay, and then an effect I like to use is like sound toys, and go to like the space setting. All these presets are really good for this kind of sound, but spaces, filters, modulation basically do the job for you if you've got this plugin. And other plugins do similar stuff. So if you've got like a multi-effects plugin, that would probably be one of my first protocols usually for these kind of sounds. So like an effect rack. And then I've chosen a rubbish preset, but reverb and delays are pretty much your go-tos for these sounds. The thing to be wary of, though, is I was saying like you want to try and do individual processing. I find that has like the best results, and you can like obviously do like group at the end. But the thing to be wary of with like reverb and delay, I think especially with these sounds, is not to overdo it, because if you're putting reverb on every single one of these, yes, it might be fine to have like a longer one here, but here, where there's a build-up of chords within the space of half a bar, more or less, and then, well, basically, yeah, where there's a build-up here, if you've got loads of reverb and delay on these, the like time isn't as important, but like the amount can basically get like really washy and create a muddy effect, which would then bleed into like the next segment of that loop, if you get me. So I'd always try and be careful with reverb and delay and not overdo it. And if you do want to use loads, you can kind of like combine it with filters. So you can have like filters before, so you take away the sound and then you're delaying what you've taken away. No, you're delaying what's remaining, sorry. So that's kind of probably the better way to do it. Like when you typically EQ, you typically EQ first, cut everything you don't want, and then apply these effects. So that's like the way you might want to do it. But then another thing that can be quite cool is to put the reverb here before the filter. If I just find this sweep. You're basically creating a muddy effect, but because you're filtering it, it's not as noticeable. It's kind of like what you do when, like, if you're familiar, like when you create like a techno rumble, that effect, you basically put reverb and all sorts of effects before, like into the chain, and then you filter it, which creates this effect. But if you filter it first, the sound isn't really as clean. Like with the rumble, the idea is that you're adding like reverb and all those kind of effects and distortion to the low end, or no, you're like filtering out the low end. I can't remember exactly, like, but the idea is that they put all these effects before the filter, essentially to give a muddy sound, like make it more clean, essentially, if that makes sense. Like by putting the reverb here and then filtering, I'm less likely to have like something that carries on, as opposed to if I've done the filtering here and then I've done the reverb and then I've got the delay, it's probably going to carry longer. So essentially experiment with like the placement of where you put these things, like filters before reverbs and that kind of thing. And then the final kind of effect I want to talk about is kind of like phasers, choruses, that kind of thing, because I think they make so much difference to these sounds. Like they make them so much more interesting. Look at the flanger, which has like that nice robotic texture, but it can get quite sore on the ears, so I peel it back. Then I've got a phaser, which also helps. We don't even have the LFO on, but it kind of does that, keeping things interesting, varying the sound up that we want. Another phaser, which is also Sound Toys. You just hear like, as the sound's moving, it just sounds so much better with these kind of effects on. It's kind of not really something you can explain more, like, when you hear it, you just know. And I've got this exact same on like very subtle, but it just changes the sound more, and more than just, I don't know, lost for words, but you kind of know what I mean. Another effect which I quite like is this micro shift. It's kind of like a detuning effect, which can work really well on these sounds. I've got a filter freak here, which I didn't talk about, probably because it's not doing much. But you basically, like I was talking about filters, you can get like the standard filters which you can alter yourself, but you can get like quite creative filters. There's a few out there. filter freak being one of them, and it basically moves the filter like a bit more like chaotically than, like, I mean, you could draw this kind of filter automation in, like where you basically just go wild like that, but that's essentially what this kind of does. And then I've got this preset here which sweeps the frequency spectrum, which works really well with this sound, to be fair. So frequency, filter, freak, and then another multi-effects plugin. I think that's Chord. MDEX is one I would recommend as well. And then I think I've pretty much touched on like the effects. Like I said, it's like all pretty much experimentation, and I've kind of like suggested good starting points. But the key one is your filter, and then I find that everything kind of like stems from that. Once you have that kind of sound you want, your options are pretty flexible, to be honest. And I'm pretty sure I used the chorus somewhere, like the chorus as well, just for a show. The chorus is a good one, like, because it kind of puts your sound in a different dimension. I think there's like a plugin called Dimension Expander which does something similar, which is free. But like detuning these sounds can work really well, like either at the source or further on in the process. And then you don't hear it as much when it's filtered, which is why I was saying about the order of the effects. So you can essentially run it into like crazy effects chain, filter it, end it with some reverb and delay, and it's probably there or thereabouts. So if you do it, so yeah, basically if you do all that, you should end up with something like this in terms of chords, or a much more basic version of it, because like I was saying at the start, like my first reference had 2 chords, but then like the one I was thinking, this one here, so you'd have like maybe a chord here, pick, chord. That's kind of like what we've done there. That's like an offbeat one, which is nice, which I was saying about the placement. Another one here. I think there's 2 here actually. Yeah, so you've got one here, you've got one here, one here, 4, 5. He's used 5 chords. So if you want to be as crazy as Djoko, then there's not really like a upper limit to how many chords you can go for. I think the main thing is that it doesn't get too messy. So with the if I take these out, I could maybe, using that reference, I could have maybe 1 or 2 other chords bouncing off one another here, maybe even the same ones, if you didn't want to create so many sounds. Like, it all comes down to taste, so you should really be like listening out for it, and as long as you like kind of follow that process, you should hopefully get something similar in terms of sounds. So yeah, I kind of hope that's been a useful kind of insight into how to create like minimal house, deep tech, however you want to classify it, chords. Kind of like using Djoko and Christosi as references, but there's a lot of them in the genre that do it. And like it's quite an easy process once you get a hang of it, and hopefully with like these 3 parts, whether this is part of a long video or separately, we'll see. But hopefully once you kind of like nail those 3 parts and have an understanding of like your MIDI information, like your chords, kind of like what sounds to go for and how to tweak them to your liking, and then how to kind of bring out those sounds with effects, you're pretty much on the way to getting those kind of sounds. Like, it's quite a common question I get asked, and there's not really, you shouldn't really overthink it, essentially. Like, so yeah, I hope that's helped you kind of have a better idea of how to achieve those sounds. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you found it useful, or you want to leave some feedback or ask questions. But anything, just ask me anything in the comments. I honestly don't mind. And if you want to support the channel, you can head down below where the website will be linked, so you can pick up various resources, and the Patreon might even be linked as well, where you can get a catalogue of resources for as low as £3 a month. So yeah, anyway, I'll leave that there because it's been very long, and I'll see you in the next one.